B'dvach, Shavua Tov. I hope tonight to complete what I started last week. If you don't know where you are, we're in the winter lecture series of 2021, or 2020 to 2021, entitled Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the mid-1980s. Tonight is the fifth lecture of what's going to be altogether 16, at least at this point. The title of tonight is Operation Moses, Israel and the Jews of Ethiopia in the mid-1980s, Part 2. Part 2. This is the Layman Lecture Series. I want to start, as I always do, by thanking the Layman family for sponsoring the series as they do year by year. Tonight's specific sponsor is anonymous, wants to be that way, not a Rabbi Rottenberg. This is someone who stepped forward when we had an extra lecture and needed a sponsor for it and did it right away. So very grateful to Anonymous. I want to thank, as I always do, our tech team. My son over here is taking from his valuable time to run this operation. Howard Elbaum took from his valuable time to put together the PowerPoint, and Yossi Wetstein is going to, as I always say, use his superb editing skills, so by the time you see this, it'll come out just right. Hopefully YouTube will allow us to use all the videos that I have for you. You never know how that works out. And without any further ado, I'll plunge into the body of my remarks. So in order to know what's going on tonight, you have to have sort of heard what happened last week, so I'm going to assume that you did. As we saw last time, Ovadia came to Ovadia. Let's go to the first one over here. Okay? That drill sergeant over there is Ovadia Chezi, and he went to Ovadia Yosef because he was an activist on behalf of the poor Ethiopian Jews who were illegal in Israel at that time, hiding in underground railroad. And he asked Ovadia Yosef for a compassionate psak, a compassionate ruling, if possible. Okay? If possible. So, I want to be clear over here that Ovadia Yosef in 1972-73 was about to have his career rocket, become Chief Rabbi of Israel. He was already famous, but become much more world famous starting now. And this guy, Ovadia Chezi, was, in addition to being the master Israeli sergeant major, drill sergeant of the entire Israeli army, was the son of a Yemenite Rav, a Deni Rav from Eritrea. And so he had all these kashers there, and he could go and talk to Ovadia Yosef. He knew that Ovadia Yosef is not a posek for hire. You understand? It's not like that. He knew Ovadia Yosef was sympathetic, which is half the struggle, because most of the people didn't give the Ethiopian Jews the time of day. He's not a jerk like Dr. Berg and the others who were really pretty bad about it. But the other half of the struggle was to ascertain what is the halachic Jewish status of the Jews of Ethiopia al pi amito shel Torah. Not for PC, and not because it's a fashionable anything. It's what is the real din of the Torah, what you and I today refer to as Das Torah. You know, in the real sense and not in the cliched sense. One of the very greatest rabbinical scholars of the 20th century, Ovadia Yosef, after doing his research, we're talking A category, I don't think I need to tell you that. After doing his research, which involved a lot of interviews with the secret Ethiopian Jews living in Israel, hiding from the law, Ovadia Yosef eventually composes and publishes his comprehensive responsum, ringingly affirming that these are full Jews. Maybe they're Tinnik Shenishba, but they're full Jews. Now, a responsum, a tshuva, for those who don't know what it is a private legal opinion. Roughly analogous, somebody writes a law article today, a professor. It could be a brilliant article. Depending on who you are and your charisma, this responsum, this article, will either get traction or it won't. But it kind of helps to have the number one Talmud Chacham in the world, or one of the top 5, issue a private ruling. And a lot of Jewish law is case law, which comes from the Shalos and Shuvas. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I would simply mention Rav Moshe Feinstein and Igros Moshe. You know, that's which are only his opinions. But it came to get a lot of traction out there, as I think most of us in America know. And what he ended up saying after a complete review of the literature and everything, was that these are Jews. They don't know about Judaism that much, but they're not. The reason that they're not conforming to regular Jewish practice is not because they're anti, but they just don't know better. It's what we call in Hebrew tinish shenish, a baby that doesn't know better. And they're also not mamzerim, which is another angle of problem, because you say they've been around for thousands of years and they got divorced, and the divorces don't count because they're not carried out in accordance with halachic norms. You could go that route. And he very carefully analyzes it. And I say again, you're talking about A-level scholar. And in general, this teshuvah, we call shalos and teshuvas, this responsum, is what you call an Avad Yosef special. If you are familiar with his responsa, which there are many volumes out now, it's a comprehensive teshuvah which takes into account the totality of halachic discourse on this subject down to his day. If anybody wrote about the Ethiopian Jews in the past, he covers it and deals with it as only he can, because everybody knows Avad Yosef was mamash a walking encyclopedia. And the bottom line was, as he put it in his teshuvah, the state of Israel is obligated to bring these guys home. Take a look at this. I'll only share with you a tiny piece. But it's ringing. He says, Lochem, it's a long teshuvah, I'm just giving you excerpt. Lochem basi lamaskana, therefore I've come to the conclusion, after analyzing this and so forth, shafalashim him tzatzaim l'shevet Yehuda shedrim l'kush, that these falashas, as he referred to them in those days, nowadays that's a politically incorrect term, but at that time people used to use it, the Ethiopian Jews, are Jewish, and somehow they ended up being driven south into Africa. And those early great rabbis who concluded that they're Jews from the 10 lost tribes, and the tribe of Dan, did so on the basis of research back in the 16th century. In other words, you find in the Shalos and Chubas, other rabbis referred to it that way, you can rely on their research. And Avad Yosef, who published this response about 10, 12 years later in a book, after he published it publicly as a response in 1973. I say it again, in his final literary form that appears about 12 years later, something like that, he, looking back, says, because I was approached by the leaders of these Ethiopian Jews, who came to me and asked, they want to join the rest of the Jewish people, as fully Orthodox Jews, to use American language. And they want to conform to the Torah Shabbat and the Talmud and the Torah Shabbat. In other words, they don't have these practices, but they know they're wrong, and they want to join the rest of us. And as we would say today, do teshuvah. That might not be the right word, but you know what I mean. And to keep all the Taryag mitzvahs as we Rabbinite Jews understand them. According to Chazal, according to the Gemara knows, they want to be, as I say again, fully Orthodox practicing Jews, as we understand the term. I said to myself, Avad Yosef says, Lo eis lachshos, this is no longer the time to be silent. And we in Israel have the responsibility to rescue these people from the threat of disappearance and assimilation in Ethiopia. And to speed up their aliyah to Israel, and to give them a Jewish education, as we would say today, and to have them join in the glorious enterprise of building up the Holy Land, the state of Israel. And as far as I'm concerned, this is part of the prophecy of B'Shav Banim Gvulam that you find in the book of Jeremiah. Now, peace and shalom out Sachnei Yudis, and Avad Yosef, writing a decade later, says, in the basis of this, I spoke, and remember, he's official chief rabbi by the time he's writing this, to the Israeli government and to the Jewish agency, and all the relevant organizations in Israel and elsewhere, to do whatever it takes to bring them now to Israel, so they shouldn't get lost, and enroll their children in frum schools in Israel, Hapsika no solos aderech lakor b'adem ki Yehuda al pichok ashut. And this ruling of mine cleared the way for the bureaucratic decision to be made by the government of the state of Israel and the relevant agencies to recognize the Jews as Jewish, the Falasha is Jewish, and therefore they're under the Chok HaShut. Therefore, they are able to take benefit of the law of return, which means they come to Israel and they're instant citizens. Instant citizens. Yeshiva Sari Mem Shalom Yosef Sachnut Hayudim, and official meetings of the government and the Jewish agency on the 16th of Shvat, Tashlad, be like December of 1974, something like that. Sukkot Api Hakama Seb Misra B'dikal Chaluz Chokashvus Ethiopia. An official decision was taken by the Israeli government to go for it. And anyway, the rest is along those lines, which means that the Israeli government said like this. You see, people don't necessarily understand. In Israel, it's a secular government, but not entirely. The government itself, according to the laws of Israel, grants to the Rabbanut, the chief rabbinate, certain legal rights. Among these are the recognition of who's a ger, who's Jewish. I'll say it again. The state of Israel, secularly, says, at least until today, you don't know if they may change the law tomorrow, that when it comes to deciding who's Jewish, that they can qualify for entering Israel, it is the Rabbanut that is the one who says who is Jewish and who's not. I said this, Ben Gurion said this in long ago. So if they say a group is Jewish, then that has legal authority, legal power. Now let's move on to the next one. Okay? From then on, let's move to the next one. From then on, Ovadia Yosef became emotionally involved. It's just an interesting story. And he, therefore, became the patron saint of the Ethiopians. It's funny to me, remember this girl, she became the Miss Universe, Miss Israel, when Obama was the president. And she went to the White House. And I remember, I forget her name, Tigne something or other, it's an Ethiopian name. She's Jewish. She's Israeli. And she won the Miss Israel beauty pageant. And maybe more, I don't know. I don't follow exactly the Miss Universe. Anyway, but Israel did. She came when Obama was president, and he said, "Who's your hero?" And she said, "Ovadia Yosef." Who's that? Okay. Now, that's not entirely true. First, she said, "I have two heroes. One is President Obama." She was stupid, you know. But to them, Ovadia Yosef is the only guy among the Jews in the rabbinate. I'm telling you the way it is. He's the only leading figure who closely identified with the Ethiopian cause, and for the rest of his life, he's trying to stay on top of it and try to help him out, which is very interesting. And and by the way, let me just do one more piece. And if you ask Ovadia Yosef, if you look at his teshuvah, he says, "I don't think they need a gerus at all. I think they are Jewish." Let's move to the next one. He says over here, "Lo achachei ki reisi lagon Rav Herzog be'chtavo l'machlakah shekasel l'fakmik b'yedusam shel falashim." I do know that other people like Rabbi Herzog and others, who are big rabbis, were in doubt, uncertain as to the actual Jewish status of these people. I'm aware of that. Because historians, ethnographers, and other academic scholars concluded that the Ethiopian Jews really come from a non-Jewish stock that somehow or other made themselves Jewish way back when. That's what they say. So therefore, if you follow that line of thought, that academic approach, they're not Jewish. Because simply the fact that they declared themselves Jewish or converted to Judaism, not knowing at all what Judaism was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years, whatever, would from the halachic standpoint not mean anything because you didn't have a halachic conversion. That is what others say. But it won't be a good gerus. And Rav Herzog said this, and others say that, all the rest of it. But Ovadia Yosef says, I strongly disagree. Look at the large letters here. For Noras Neflasi, Masharal Kocha, I was shocked to see a guy like Rav Herzog, Lidchos Divri Goni Olam Shakam Bevado Shein Savik Shein Shebedan, Mipnei Divreim Shal Chokrim Shematili Savik Biadusam. So I'm shocked that an Orthodox rabbi, he says, writing in rabbinic literature, which I told you last week is very self-referential. And he's a from guy, Rav Herzog. So what the heck do you care about what some professor says somewhere? We go by the rabbinic system. What does it say in the Sfarim? And if great rabbis like the Radbaz and others, Mari Castor and whoever, long ago, halakhic authorities, said that these people are Jewish, I couldn't care less, he says, what some ethnographer says. You understand? Me nidchem ibnei me. Who gets pushed aside by whom? Atmoa, bitmia. Right? In other words, the heck with the scientists, the heck with the ethnographers. They're Jewish. And that's how we paskin. And we don't bring other people out there. Now, this is not a simple matter, but nevertheless, I'm telling you what Yosef said in 1973. And he goes on to say, Mikol Mokum, nevertheless, he is Shari'isi, Shasa Maisa, Betziva, Nosan Sal, Shitznei Talchun, Vyasa Hatavas Dam Brisa, Tvila. Since I saw the Rav Herzog and others said they want to do what you call a Geirus L'chumram, do Hatavas Dam Brisa. In other words, undergo a conversion ceremony based on the following theory. What the heck, it doesn't hurt. Right? You know, can't hurt. Since they did that, and the Ethiopian Jews did not protest, and there were very few actual Ethiopian Jews who arrived in Israel, and they did not protest at being required to undergo a second or whatever, a Geirus ceremony. So I figure, what the heck? I'm not going to argue with Rav Herzog. Umios Tov, I'll take you up. And rather than make a fight, let it be. Ulam, but I just want you to know, Avad Yosef says, I don't think they need a Geirus at all. Right? Ladati, Ladino, Lochin Anochi Madi, I don't agree. Vadaiti Sheish Lismoch al Poskim Anal. I think you can rely on the great rabbinic authorities of the 16th century. I mean, these are the people who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. Shafalashim Yudim Chol Davar Be'enu Srichim Shum Ger Afilu Chumrah. I really don't need a Chumrah. So basically, you understand what he's saying. He's saying, listen, if the Ethiopian Jews agree, can't hurt. But I don't think they need it. And that's, like I say, a ringing response. It's interesting, you know, just now before I did gain this talk, I pulled out the art scroll bio of Rabbi Yosef, and I don't think they have anything about the Ethiopians at all. You see, the Frum world is not comfortable with his outspoken stand on this, but he couldn't care less. That's what Rabbi Yosef says. He said, you know, let justice be done to the heavens fall. This he calls like you see it, and as far as he's concerned, these people are Jewish. But on the other hand, he said if other poskim, and Ramosha Feinstein also said they should do a Geirus L'chumram. So for those of you who don't understand what I'm talking about, very briefly, suppose somebody comes and says, I'm Jewish. Now, let's say you're not Jewish. You know, your mother's conversion wasn't good, or this and the other. I'm just making this up. And let's say the guy wants to marry a Jewish girl. Whatever, wants to join the shul. So, you know, one thing you can do is say, oh, listen, just do another ceremony. It doesn't hurt. And, you know, go to mikvah, you did a very minimal, I mean, he's already circumcised, you did hatofas tam bris, very minimal sort of thing. And that way we remove even any doubt. So it's a highly legalistic approach, but the halachic system is highly legalistic. And so he said, let's do that with the Ethiopians, and then there's no question whatsoever that they're Jewish. The only question is were they born Jewish or they're Megayer. But then it's 100% that they're Jewish. That's what he said. Now, this all took place in early 1973, which was 25 years after Israel had been around, kind of late in the day. And now that the rabbinate, because Rabbi Yosef was shortly after elected as chief rabbi of Israel, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, once the Rabbanut had pronounced the Ethiopians Jewish, the state of Israel and the Sachnut should have commenced preliminary work in 73 on bringing the Jews to Israel. But this did not happen because it was the Golden Meir Israel, as we see in the next slide. Right? You still had the same band of politicians, and Dr. Berg, I don't know what's with him. Every time he was in office, he wouldn't let any Ethiopians in. Even though he was a religious Jew, a religious Zionist, it seems to be he had issues with them. And then to make matters worse, of course, what happened in 73? The Yom Kippur War broke out. All hell broke loose. Everyone's attention was diverted, understandably, to Israel's national security and physical survival. To say nothing of the aftermath of the war with the oil embargo and the Kissinger stuff and the fall of Golda Meir and her government and her cronies, the rise of Yitzhak Rabin, as we see in the next slide, and a new set of cronies. Okay, these are, they're not exactly a new team. Rabin and Peretz have been around for a long time, but now they're in the front seat with Rabin as the prime minister and Peretz as the defense minister. This was the situation, so nothing was done. Now, the situation, the story now, my friends, has become dramatic, but in a negative way. Because here we are in 1974 and nothing happened, but a Holocaust of sorts is about to descend upon Ethiopia. A Holocaust that would last about 20-25 years. In order to understand this, and how the Jews of Ethiopia would be affected, I have to explain to you a little bit of a subject that ordinarily would be boring, and that is the history of Ethiopia in the 20th century. 100 years ago, you go to 1920, Ethiopia, listen closely, and let's look at the next map. Ethiopia was a Christian black state run by an emperor. It's a feudal system. So it's an African black state, it's Christian, and it's run by an emperor with the nobles. You understand, the feudal system. It was landlocked. Historically, Ethiopia was not one of these countries that said we want a port city or something like that. They're very isolated, and they never were on the sea. The territory along the sea, which is next door to Ethiopia, was number one Muslims, and number two, by the time in the 1920s, ruled by the British, the Italians, and the French. Look at this map very quickly over here. As you can see, what it calls the Ethiopian Empire. If you look where the sea is, you see three pieces of territory, or even four, in different colors. One is Italian Eritrea, then in the middle is Djibouti, that's French, then you see British Somalia, and then you see Italian Somalia. Now, you don't have to memorize this, there's no test, but my point is that Ethiopia used to be a landlocked country. Now, eventually, 1930s, Mussolini invaded and conquered Ethiopia, but then the British kicked him out in World War II. After the war, as a poetic justice, Ethiopia was given Eritrea. So this coastal area, as you see over there, opposite Saudi Arabia more or less, Eritrea was annexed to Ethiopia. And it was no longer landlocked. So as you can kind of see, let's go to the next one. If you look over there, that's one big Ethiopian territory, and now it's on the sea, on the Red Sea. The trouble was that the Eritreans, I know you never heard of them. It's a country, by the way, for your kids in what's his name, Mr. Leach's class, yeah. So he says the Eritreans did not want to be under Ethiopia. They see the Americans, the British, the UN, they figured all these black people, it's all one thing, so who cares? Africa is full of hundreds and hundreds of different tribes who don't get along with each other. It's a racism to bunch them all together. But that's what happened. The Eritreans, who were Muslim, experienced the Ethiopian occupation as oppression. And by 1961, the Eritreans had launched a Viet Cong type of war against the Emperor Haile Selassie. That, as you see in this map, Ethiopia annexed Eritrea, and this led to wars. The Eritreans trying to break away from Ethiopia against the Emperor Haile Selassie. That's one of the main reasons that Haile Selassie kissed up to Israel in the 1950s and 60s. He desperately needed Israeli military expertise in helping his army fight against the Eritrean uprising. Now, the Emperor was never able to suppress the rebellion. He can only keep things on a low boil. That's the politics of Ethiopia up to the 70s. Remember, the Jews did not live in Eritrea. The Jews that we're talking about, the Ethiopian Jews, lived in Ethiopia proper, in northern Ethiopia. Let's go to the next one. If you look at that map, and you look at the northern part of Ethiopia, you see where it says Gondar and Tigray. That's the main area, that lake up there. That's the area where the Ethiopian Jews lived. Now, where they lived, they were not directly affected by the rebellion under Haile Selassie. The Jews' problem was with the local Ethiopian Christians and their constant but low-level persecution of the Jews. The Jews' problem was not the Eritrean Muslims with their high level of violence, okay? Now, it's just interesting for our story where the Jews lived, which again I point to in the northern part of the country. Could I use a laser pointer on this? Or what? Okay. For the relatively northern part of the country, those people are the more advanced ones in Ethiopia. I would compare them roughly to like the Kurds in Iraq, in the sense of being a cut above and a little bit better to the Jews. They lived around them for many centuries. It's an oversimplification, but not really. And so it's important, let's go to the next one, to realize that when we talk about the Jews, they're located, as you see on the left-hand side, these are the states, the provinces of Ethiopia. You see Tigray all the way in the north, right? Or on the right-hand side, it's located over there in the country. This is where the Jews were in Ethiopia. Now, this was the situation until 1973. After the Yom Kippur War, the status quo in Ethiopia collapsed. Under the emperor, you had in Ethiopia a feudal system with nobles owning the land and screwing over the peasants with an inefficient society. I mean, Ethiopia had slavery until World War II. You hear what I'm saying? Black on black slavery. I'll say it again. Ethiopia, a Christian country, had Negro slaves, as they used to call them, who were slaves of other Negroes in Ethiopia. It's only when World War II came around that Roosevelt and Churchill said, listen, you can't fight Hitler and have a slavery, you know. So 1942, relatively late, they abolished slavery. So it was a very reactionary kind of society. And after a while, by the time you get to the 1970s, young, mid-level army officers, captains, majors, that sort of thing, started dreaming of overthrowing the old backward system, creating a modern country with land reform for the peasants. So there shouldn't be a situation where a couple of nobles own all the land and they tax the heck out of the peasants, but the peasants get the actual land themselves. Universal education for the public, and all kinds of progressive ideas. As we all know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The emperor's government was particularly discredited by the high gas prices after the oil crisis following the Yom Kippur War and other things. The old emperor had to yield more and more power to the young officers who organized themselves into something called the Derg, which is the National Committee. As you see over here, and these are the leaders, especially the guy in the middle, Gentleman Gisto. Now, just before Rosh Hashanah of the year 1974, the Derg deposed the emperor, and later they killed him. They smothered him with a pillow. Not that the emperor was a nice guy. The Derg then proclaimed themselves the legitimate government of the country, and they proclaimed their intentions to set up a communist country. Not that they knew anything about Marx, but that way they could get support from the Soviets. They had the mentality, I would say more or less, of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. At the same time, they're radicals. They figure when we restructure society and kill everybody, millions of people, if they get in the way of the restructuring of society. So basically, I'm looking at 10 million people. I'm willing to kill 9.5 with no problem whatsoever, so that the other 500,000 will live in a perfect socialist society. Notice they were nuts. Now, we know that communism in the 20th century involved two things. Number one, it involved a police state with efficient control of power. So in other words, a communist country is a stable country imposed by force. And number two, a centrally controlled communist economy, ostensibly for the benefit of the masses. The Derg in Ethiopia could do neither, as the situation in the country was incredibly complex. First of all, Ethiopia included large non-Ethiopian territories and ethnicities, thanks to the Ethiopian imperialism that I tried to describe in the late 19th century last week. When the emperor fell, these regions now strove for independence, and every ethnicity in Shevet set up its own army to fight the Derg army, and so chaos ensued. Let's look at the next map. Wherever you see those things, you see wars. So the country went crazy, right? For example, if you look in Eritrea along the coast, there's a bunch of wars because they want to get rid of Ethiopia. If you look on the lower right-hand side, you see what they call the Agaden, which is a Muslim territory that had been conquered by Ethiopian Christians in the late 19th century, but now Somalia wants them because they're all Muslims. So that's a bunch of wars. Then get in the lower, I don't have to give you all this. You get the idea, okay? And particularly where the Jews live, around that lake over there, north of Addis Ababa, there's also a bunch of wars. So the whole country went into a chaos. The Derg responded with a red terror. Okay, tried to kill everybody. Let's go to the next one. And so the guy on the left, he became the dictator. That's General Mengistu, Colonel Mengistu, whatever he was. And he imagined himself like a Lenin or a Robespierre. What did Lenin do in the Russian Revolution? What did Robespierre do in the French Revolution? They killed everybody. You see? That's how they came to power. They just killed everybody. I mean, by the millions. You understand? And so I'll do that. And that way we'll bring order to the country. And so he kills 1 million Ethiopians, you see? That's a lot of people where I come from. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, let's look at the next slide. Read this. This is what happened in Ethiopia now. Thousands of men and women were rounded up and executed in the following 2 years, 74, 75, 76. Amnesty International estimates it's 500,000 dead. That's really more. Groups of people were herded into churches and then burned down. It's like Hitler. And women were subjected to systematic rape by soldiers. Save the Children Fund reported the victims of the Red Terror, not only adults, they killed 1,000 children, mostly aged between 11 and 13, whose corpses were left in the streets of Addis Ababa, the capital city. So you're dealing with unbelievable savagery over here, okay? Now I repeat, this is Ethiopians killing Ethiopians. Now, by the way, that's just a taste. It was a lot worse than what you just read. Now, the problem is, Mengistu was not a Robespierre or a Lenin. He didn't have their power. He lacks their organizing genius, even though it was evil. Unlike them, he cannot gain iron control over the country. So it's a mess. The fighting and killing goes on and on, all through the 70s, the 80s, and 90s. And the country is full of dozens of armies. Hear what I said? Dozens of armies and armed bands. So Ethiopia descends into a nightmare with civilians suffering on an immense scale. So now you know what I mean when I said last week. Had Israel taken the Ethiopian Jews out before 1974, which they could have done, all the Jews would have ducked a bullet big time. Right? It's very sad. It's a little bit, reminds me, in Israel bought these Famine in the time of Sal Shabbat, 1949, 50, 51, and 52. And they had a hard time with the mob around all. That's true, they did. But believe you me, how do you think an Iraqi Jew living in Tel Aviv today thinks when he looks at what's going on in Iraq? The country's in a chaos. Or Syria. He said, thank God I got out of there in Israel. Right? Ducked a bullet. So the Ethiopian Jews, let's just pretend they would have taken them out after the 67 war, which they could have easily done. Then who cares? I'm talking about from the Israel Jewish perspective. Who cares what happens to Ethiopia? We're out of here. You see? But it did not happen. Now, here we go. Now our story resumes, the Jewish part. When the Derg took over and hooked up with the communist world, Israel should have been expelled from Ethiopia. This is very complex. Formally, Haile Selassie the Emperor severed relations with Israel before the Yom Kippur War as part of the Egyptian diplomatic offensive in Africa in 1973. Preparatory to the Yom Kippur War, Sadat, president of Egypt, and his diplomats, who were brilliant, they went around to all the African countries and they got each one to break relations with Israel. It's a famous episode. So even countries that were highly dependent on Israel had to go along for PC. So Ethiopia, that depended on hundreds of Israeli specialists in the universities, in the medicine, in the military, and every other field, officially broke relations with Israel because of the PC. In reality, though, many countries in Africa continue to have what I would refer to as illicit relations with Israel because they said to the Israelis, we don't have any relations with you. Really, we do. In other words, please keep your doctors here. Please keep your soldiers here. Please keep your, farm agricultural experts here and things like that. In Ethiopia, this means that the secret military Israeli people remained in Addis Ababa to help the emperor's army with training and weapons. You just have no idea what I'm talking about. Haile Selassie flew to Brazil for a visit in 1960. When he flew to Brazil, the army revolted or something like that, and they deposed him. Israel then flew a special commando thing and restored him to power. Do you see what I'm saying? People don't know all these little details. in these African countries in which they really were dependent on Israeli expertise. So now, here you are in 73 and 74, the Israeli Mossad station is still there. The Israeli military advisor group is still there. As a matter of fact, under the emperor, Addis Ababa became the #1 Mossad base in Black Africa. It was the nerve center of Israeli security activities throughout Africa. It was like in Iran under the Shah, when the Mossad had a special, station there with all kind of privileges. Let's go to the next one. Here you have both the Shah and Haile Selassie, and they were living in sin with the Mossad, because the Mossad trained their security services and helped their army and bodyguards and all that kind of business. Now, when the Derg takes over, Mengistu allowed the Israelis to remain secretly behind because of their utility, particularly during the Ogaden War when Russia sided with Somalia. I know I'm totally confusing you. Let's go to this map. I'll just take a second to try to unconfuse you, and then I'll abandon hope. You see, that's Ethiopia. You see on the right side of the map is like flatter, and that right side of the map, they're not Ethiopian people, they're really Muslims. And therefore, Somalia, which is a country which goes all the way around that hook coast, they wanted it. And Ethiopia, so it was a big machlok, it was a big war between the two countries. This gave Russia trouble because like this, both are communist countries, both are stooges, and they both want help from Moscow. Moscow had to pick somebody, and so Moscow decided to back, Somalia. So then Ethiopia said, well, we need help, we'll go to Israel, like that. Okay? So in addition, so that's why even a terrible dictator like Mengistu kept the Israelis behind secretly. In addition, many officers in the Ethiopian army, the Derg guys, had been trained in earlier times in the Ethiopian West Point by Israeli instructors with whom they had personal relationships. Under the emperor, he couldn't do anything, right? And so he said, set up an army at West Point for me, and most of the teachers were Israelis. And that means, therefore, young guys who are going to be graduates are going to know their Rabbi, so to speak. And when they rise in the army and then become big shots in the new revolutionary government, I mean, the guy knows this Israeli guy, knows that Israeli guy. So the personal element is there. This is very important in my opinion, by the way, because it meant that the incredibly ruthless and cruel Derg did not specifically target the Jews. Although the Jews suffered plenty as collateral damage, it could have been a lot worse. It could have been genocidal, because these guys were nuts. They were, if Mengistu would have decided, I'm just going to kill the 100,000 Jews in Ethiopia and the heck with it, I mean, he would have done it. You understand? But he didn't think in those terms. Now, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, who ran Israel at that time, did not use this opportunity to get the Jews out. That's what they should have done. They said, listen, Ethiopia is dependent on us to a degree. We have a special relationship with them. It's not that many Jews. They don't care about the subject that much. Why would they? And let's just say, listen, we're giving you weapons, we're giving you this and the other. Let us bring the Jews out of Ethiopia. Now, Rabin, as I told you before, did make an official decision in the government that the Ethiopian Jews should be brought to Israel, which was a step forward. Now, why did Rabin actually do that in 1975? Why did the Israeli government, late in the day, say, we're making an official decision, this is 2 years after Yosef, that the Ethiopian Jews should be brought to Israel? I'll tell you what cynical people and myself say. It's very simple. Take a look at the next one. That's the year the UN passed the racism resolution, Zionism with racism. Remember Mordechai's famous speech against that resolution to all the countries, especially African countries, said Zionism is racism. Well, what's the best answer to Zionism and racism? So we got black Jews. We're bringing them to Israel. So it's a cynical. You understand? It's a cynical. Now, it's not really full-hearted. It's a PR thing. And nothing really happened, I'm sorry to say. To complicate matters even more, if such a thing is possible, the Tigray province revolted against the Derg, and a bitter war ensued over there. So if you're Jewish, what do you care if your village is wiped out by Team A or Team B? Either way, it gets wiped out. So the bottom line is, from 1974 to 77, no Jews really were brought to Israel, as Ethiopia's Jews, along with everybody else in the country, suffered terribly from the civil war and the accompanying famines, from which millions died. Then came the second big change after Yosef. There was an election of Menachem Begin, who was the first prime minister of Israel who was not a racist. That's a tough statement to make. Let's go to the next one. Right? Begin had a different calculus. He said a Jew's a Jew. So the skin color didn't matter to him, anything like that. Now actually, to be honest, the first thing Menachem Begin did was consult with Rabbi Yosef. Let's go to the next slide. Just to make sure. And he said to Rabbi Yosef, Kvod Rav, I want to know, you examined the subject. Are they Jewish? And Rabbi Yosef said, they're 100% Jewish. And Begin said, this is all I want to know. I don't need to know anymore. Okay? And so, Begin said, I guess we got to do something about this. But now you run into what we call in America the deep state. It was Menachem Begin versus the deep state. The Israelis in Addis Ababa, walking on a tightrope, dealing with the devil incarnate, want to keep things strictly on a realpolitik basis. They said, with this dictator, you can't start bringing up humanitarian concerns and the Jews and all the rest of it. We should be glad that we have some kind of security relationship with them of any sort whatsoever. Because as we see in the next slide, Mengistu was the devil incarnate. Okay, I mean, this is the type of guy who got breakfast with you and they shoot your children in front of you. That's what we're dealing with. And so they said, don't bring up the Jews and all the rest of it. To appease Menachem Begin, because Begin said we got to do something, so they fill a plane that had secretly landed with weapons with 200 Jews on a return trip to Israel. And there was one time Israel flew in a secret plane with the weapons to help Mengistu against the Somalians, if you can follow that ball game. And since they had an extra empty plane, so they said to Mengistu, listen, do you mind? We'll put a couple hundred Jews on there, what the heck? And he said, all right, fine. It's better that way I don't have to pay you money. Okay? And that's what happened. So this 200 Jews or so is a drop in the bucket, of course. But let's go to the next slide. As my mother used to say, a bissel about the full of shitzel. You start with little, the drop by drop, and eventually get to a big bucket. This group of 200 Jews that was done as a sort of afterthought in this unbelievably cynical deal with the devil incarnate is the first group Israel did klita to. Notice now the system is starting to change. You take in Olim, you bring them to Merkaz Klita, I think it was in Ofakim or someplace like that, Kiryat Malachi. And now the Ethiopians are starting to become part of the Israeli reality. Now, how did they choose which 200 to put on the plane? Now begins, my friends, our story tonight. Most Ethiopian Jews were villagers, shepherds, things like that, without higher education. But there were some Jews who received formal education in the course of the 20th century. These educated types had served under Haile Selassie. They lived in the capital city. They were engaged with public affairs. I mean, there weren't many of them, but there were some. These were the Jews known to the Mossad and to the IDF in Addis Ababa. I mean, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so forth. If you were an Israeli, you knew there's some Jews living in Ethiopia, but where do you come across them? You might see a guy who works in the government in this position or that, or a teacher somewhere, and the guy might say, you know, I'm actually Jewish. Okay? They knew they were Jewish, but the Israelis had never tried to bring them to Israel. De facto, these educated Jews were the kesher between the secret Israeli mission in Addis Ababa and the Jews in the north of the country, the Hamonam. Accordingly, it was these educated Jews who had some Zionist feelings, and some of them had a little daring, who helped the Israeli mission draw up the list of 200 names. In doing so, however, these educated Ethiopian Jews drew attention to themselves from the Derg authorities, who were always suspicious of any Ethiopian who had contacts with foreigners. It's a dictatorship. Now, as long as the secret affair between the Derg and Israel was going on with the weapons and all that, as long as Israel was supplying Ethiopia, these educated Jews were okay, but just barely. But not long after the 200 were flown to Israel, the foreign minister of Israel, Moshe Dayan, did an unbelievably unforgivable thing. He squealed. He gave a public conference and he said, you know, we're actually helping, and like I'm saying now, we're actually helping Ethiopia by providing secret weapons. In exchange, they're sending Jews out of the country for us. Why did he do that? Moshe Dayan was not a dumbbell, obviously. He knew how to keep secrets and like the demon and all the rest of it. Cynical people, including myself, will say he didn't like bringing the Ethiopian Jews in, therefore we wanted to blow the whole thing. If that's true, it's unbelievable avera. Now, I hope I'm wrong. Maybe he just had a bad day. It's possible. And he just blew it. But these kind of things, Soda Hashem Lev, you got to keep your mouth shut. And he didn't do so. Immediately got all over the world. Mengistu, the dictator in Ethiopia, is shocked and outraged at being outed. Exposure of his Israeli ties embarrassed him with the Soviets and the Arab states. the radical Arabs. In a rage, Mengistu closes everything down. We're breaking relations with Israel. The Mossad out of here. The military advisor is out of here. No Israelis in the country whatsoever. He totally breaks relationships, and now Israel has no presence in Ethiopia and won't for a long time. That's a real bummer because it is the country that has all the Jews. The educated Ethiopians who cooperated with the Mossad, who cooperated with the Israelis, are now really in trouble. They're really screwed over. And in the crosshairs of the Derg and of the Red Terror, because they're, I would call it KGB groups, going around and killing people. Some Jews are indeed caught and tortured. Some of the educated Jews. I found a piece online where guys describing, look at this, how they broke his legs or whatever. It's very sad.
Ethiopia, 1974. Haile Selassie's feudal regime collapses. The military takes over.
אני חושב הוא רצה לשנות הכל מאפס, להתחיל מהכל מאפס. כל מי שידע לקרוא וכתוב, לחסל אותו לגמרי.
שלחו אותי בסוהר הגדול שנקרא באטה גונדר. שם לא הכנתי את השם. כל הסימן האלה נמצא עליו שם. התחלתי ללכת ככה. בשביל שפה ביד.
And he survived it. Imagine those who died is terrible. Some of these educated Jews flee for their lives. But where do you run to? The answer is the country next door is Sudan. I mean, there's one guy who walks there. Take a look at the next slide. To walk from Gondar to Khartoum is farther than, it's 500 miles. It's 475 miles. It's farther than walking to Boston, okay? And by the way, it's not up, 695. You're talking about desert surrounded with bandits and armies and behemoths and things like that, kayas. It's terrible. So it's a terrible trek, but, when you run away, you run away. And so the guy did it. This guy, by the way, let's look at the next slide, will become important for our story. He's actually very well known in Israel, Fredig Aklum, not in America. Now, Sudan is an unusual Arab country. It's a Muslim country whose complexity makes Ethiopia look simple. For our purposes tonight, suffice it to say that Sudan has always had an up and down secret relationship with Israel, going back to the 1950s, when both countries opposed Egypt's Nasser, because Nasser wanted to take over the Sudan. But Sudan is also headquarters of, what's his name was hiding there? Osama bin Laden, of the Muslim extremists. Over the years, Israel alternated between helping the Christian black rebels in South Sudan. Remember Darfur? Remember that? Israel helping Darfur. On the one hand, and on the other hand, cooperating secretly with the Sudanese government. By the way, today, Sudan has been broken into two parts. It's not one country anymore. But at the time I'm talking about, it was one big country. Therefore, from time to time, there has been a Mossad presence in the capital city of Khartoum. But at the time we're talking about, there was no Mossad presence, because Sudan was anti-Israel. Now, this Ethiopian guy you see in front of you, Fredig Aklum, exhausted after walking nearly 500 miles, hiding his identity, he couldn't have made it if he wasn't a smart fellow, arrives in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. I don't know how he survived, but somehow he wrote some postcards to relief agencies in Europe, including some Jewish ones. Listen, you can't send a postcard to Israel from Sudan to get killed. But he writes to Geneva and places like that, and basically what he says is, get me out of here, my life is in danger. And this postcard, I think he sent to an American group, and they sent it to the Mossad, something like that. And it's forwarded to Menachem Begin. And Begin himself gets a copy and reads it with interest. The Mossad tells its top spy in Black Africa, Danny Limor. He's a famous guy, he gives speeches now. Danny Limor. Uruguayan guy, went to, made Aliyah, went to KBY, and then was in the Tzanchanim, and then became a big James Bond guy. So they tell this guy, go to Khartoum, which is another country. You have to go secretly. You're an Israeli spy. You could get killed. Locate this guy and bring him to Israel. After searching for a needle in a haystack, Danny Lamore finds this guy, Freddie Aklum, and exfiltrates him to Israel. This is a movie by itself. This guy, Freddie Aklum, meets up with Menachem Begin and the Mossad, and he says, listen, what I did, I've discovered, is a possible way out. This is a route of escape, maybe. If the Derg won't allow Jews to fly out of planes from Ethiopia, which will be the simplest way, Jews can walk to the Sudanese border, like 1 million Ethiopians are doing, fleeing from the war. That's a lot of people, 1 million. From Gondar, where most of the Jews live, it's about 150, 200 miles, something like that, to the border. Now, that's not easy, 200 miles, but it's doable. And once in Sudan, the UN and other do-gooder groups have set up a ton of refugee camps. Let's get these Jews into those refugee camps, and then from there, Israel can figure out a way how to get them to Israel. It is a terrible trek, but I did it. Okay? Let's go to the next map. So there you see Ethiopia. At the bottom you see the, if you can see that different color, Ezor HaYishub Shel Bata Yisrael. So in the Ethiopia part, that blotch is where most of the Jews live. And then you see to the Sudanese border, it's not that far. And then you got to get what they call Machnot Platin, which is the UN camps. So that's the objective. Get over there, and there at least they give you food. Okay? Now, until you get there, you don't get the food. So you could starve or whatever. But once you get there, you get food. And basic, needs. Now, to Menachem Begin, that's all this needs. This conjures up the 1930s. Let's go to the next one. Menachem Begin's whole metzius was, he remembered when the Jewish refugees struggled to get into Palestine, but the Goyim, as he puts it, blocked them, leaving them to perish in the Holocaust. Begin himself, when he was once in Romania, gave a whole speech. He said, I remember leading a whole group of wannabe runaways from Poland and Austria to try to get to Palestine, and the British blocked us. We couldn't go down the Danube. You understand? They all perished in the Holocaust. So now, see, to him, it's not black and white. It's Jew and non-Jew. That's the way he thinks. And he said, we're back to the same business. But now there's Israel. That in 1938, 39, there was no Israel. Now there's Israel, so we can't let this happen. Okay? So, basically, Begin calls in the head of Mossad, General Huffy. Let's look at the next one. And he tells him in no uncertain terms, this is a priority now. We're going to prioritize this now. Okay? And I want a complete change of attitude. Notice, I don't know how people are thinking until then, but in Israel, the way it's set up is the Mossad is the prime minister's personal toy. You understand? I know it sounds funny what I'm saying, but I don't mean it to be funny. The Mossad is an organization that works for the prime minister of Israel. It doesn't work for the cabinet and the others. That's the system. And so that's where they take the orders from. And Begin's like, I'm the prime minister, I'm telling you what to me, this is a priority. Okay? So one of the things that Mossad's going to do is work on getting the Jews out. Thus energized, notice once they got this cleared orders from the top, the Mossad gets down to business. Finally, he said, 30 years after Israel became a state, finally get down to business, and they accept the strategy of this guy, Freddie Aklum, and they task him with risking his life, going back to Ethiopia, and spreading the word in Tigray and Gondar and those provinces, and use the Jewish telegraph. Tell this guy, and then one will yak to the other, and it'll spread across the villages. But how do you get them out once they reach Sudan? At this point, Sudan is very Arab and very hostile to Israel. The Mossad cannot operate there without some kind of a cover, some kind of shtick, some kind of infrastructure. This is the nuts and bolts behind the James Bond, which the public doesn't understand. You want to have spies in a country, where do they eat? Where do they sleep? Where do they get a car from without being caught? How do you stop them on the street? Where do you go to the bathroom? All those kind of little things are kind of important, without which you can't start your James Bond operations. So there are no Jews in Khartoum. As I said before, it's Osama bin Laden type place. So what do you do? In typical Mossad style, they discover the right yid to set up a business office in Khartoum. The Mossad has a Jewish Rolodex. And it's this guy. Let's go to the next one. They find a guy who's Iranian. Listen to this. He lives in Manchester. He's a British subject. He's Iranian Jew, born in Iran. He came to Israel when he came to England when he's 18 years old. Manchester has always been the headquarters of the textile business around the world. And he's one of these guys that started with nothing and built himself to a billionaire. I looked online. He was the guy who was worth £4 billion. Pounds. Now, named David Alliance, whatever. And so he's a loaded guy. He is a major player in the international cotton business. Get it? That's how he made his money. Nothing wrong with that. By the way, there's nothing illegitimate in what I just said. The guy was an international businessman. And, you import cotton from wherever you sell to the manufacturers and so forth. So, the main, probably the only export in Sudan is cotton. It's the Nile River, And he has been doing business with them as a business thing for years. And he's one of their main business connections, I guess you'd say, in terms of exporting their stuff around the world. And so he has contacts in Khartoum, and it would totally make sense for a guy like him to say, I'm setting up a branch of my office in Khartoum, and I'm sending you some of my employees to run the office. You tell me who this employee is going to be. Okay? Now, I found this piece from the BBC, of all people, who usually very into Israel, in which they did some interview with him. It's quite remarkable, a number of years ago. Take a look at this.
For 2,000 years, Jews had lived in Ethiopia.
In the mid-70s, there was a revolution in Ethiopia and civil war, and the Jews, many of them fled to Sudan.
Having escaped civil war in their homeland, the Jews are stuck in appalling refugee camps. In Sudan, their religion makes life even harder.
You couldn't say that you are a Jew. Otherwise, they would get, afraid of you. My sister, they burned her clothes that were hung on the rope.
News of their desperate plight reaches Israel.
And one of them somehow managed to send a letter to Israel saying, we are here in Sudan, we are stranded, we need your help, help us.
Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin decides to act.
Begin was himself a refugee. He fled from the Nazis in Poland during the Second World War, leaving his family, unfortunately, to suffer their fate in the Holocaust. And since then, he'd become convinced that Israel must do everything it can to help Jews when they're in trouble. So when this letter turns up, he knows he must do everything he can to save the Ethiopian Jews.
Begin turns to his secret service, the Mossad.
The Prime Minister, he called the chief of the Mossad, and he told him, we have this news about Jews in Sudan, bring me the Jews of Ethiopia out of Sudan. Now, how do you take them out? Because Sudan is an Arab country, enemy, member of the Arab League.
With official relations between Israel and Sudan blocked, Mossad need a way to work covertly. They approach a then little-known Manchester businessman. He receives a phone call he never expected.
When I received the telephone call, my secretary was given 15 minutes to them. When I heard the story, I canceled my appointment. And we discussed. They wanted me to involve because of my trade on cotton.
David is an unlikely savior of the Ethiopian Jews. At 13, he had left school to become a market trader in his native Iran. 5 years later, in search of his fortune, he moved to Manchester, setting up a series of successful textile companies.
The Israelis approached David Alliance because he was a successful international businessman with good contacts in the Sudan. This enabled him to set up an office in Khartoum, and it's from that office that Mossad agents were able to plan their rescue operation.
Okay, so now you know the background behind the movie, because once they set up a base in the capital, a legitimate base in the capital city of Sudan, I can't emphasize how important this is. The Mossad came up, as we all know now from the movies, with the famous idea of the diving resort, which I spoke about a year or two ago before they made the movie. Okay, so if you look at the slide, to the next slide, right? This is now a famous movie. Probably everybody's seen it. It's not entirely accurate. And by the way, what that Israeli guy said was also not entirely accurate. But that's okay. It's not like they sent a message from Sudan. The story is rather the way I pieced it together, but it's good enough, for government work. Now, The international situation favored this operation, the famous diving resort shtick. 500,000 refugees had poured into Sudan, way beyond the ability of the country to handle. And as a result, it was a conference in Khartoum, international for the United Nations, with numerous international charities and do-gooder groups and organizations, which resulted in NGOs undertaking to care for different refugee groups because Sudan couldn't afford it. Sudan was then flooded with NGOs and do-gooders. In other words, the country was flooded with foreigners. That's great for the Mossad, right? As a camouflage. You know, you don't stand out if you're a non-Sudanese guy running around the country. All kind of people are doing that. Freddie Aklum, that Ethiopian guy, moves around the refugee camps. Now he's working for Mossad. Refugee camps in Sudan, and he sets up a network of young Jews. So he goes to this camp and this camp, and you know, he knows who the Jews are. They know the difference between the different tribes among themselves. And he'll go to the group, this camp and this camp and this camp, and he can identify her Jews. And he talks to the young guys there, the older teens, and he sets up a network of young Jews to coordinate getting the Jews out through the diving resort in coordination with the Israeli Navy, which is a story that's been made famous by the movie. Again, I refer you to the way the BBC describes it.
Using David's office to travel in and out of Sudan, Mossad discover a perfect base close to the refugee camps to carry out the evacuation. Gad Shimron is recruited to help run it.
I went down to Sudan as a member of the operating team of the new holiday village, Arus, 40 kilometers from Port Sudan. It allowed you to go around the country and to drive to Port Sudan and bring tourists and go out at night and day, whenever you want actually, with your rubber boats, because you're bringing tourists to the unique diving spots of Sudan.
Gad and his team create a plan. They will pick up Jewish refugees at confidential meeting points, rendezvous with the Israeli Navy offshore, and then escort the Jews to Israel.
We had what we call the committee members. Committee members were young Jewish boys in the camps who were our contact liaison people. In case we said, tomorrow, 20 hours or 8 p.m., 200 people at the quarry 10 kilometers south of the refugee camp. And we would come with our trucks, pick them up, drive through the police control and then army control. Usually we have done it smoothly by bribing our way through.
Now, as I say, this story's now been made famous by Hollywood. And so this is what happened now. For the next couple of years, very low profile, you bring a couple here, and they transfer them from the Navy. You understand that's the Red Sea, they go right up to Eilat. In addition, Israel was able 9 times to secretly land these big Hercules planes nearby and load up Jews and fly them to Israel. So they were able occasionally to take people out through through airplanes. I think there was some American Jewish do-gooder group, I forget who, and somehow or other they were able to get out 200. There was at one time, but the Mossad did like this. They got a guy from Kenya. Kenya has a good relation with Israel. Remember, Kenya helped Israel in Entebbe. Remember that? And so they got a guy, and Kenya at that time had a border with Sudan. And a guy came over here and he said, I want to help your overloaded problem with the refugees. I need 100 people to work on my factory in Kenya, and I'll take 100 guys off your hands. And I'll pick this guy and this guy and that guy and that guy. And they drove them in trucks back to Kenya. Now once they're in Kenya, you can fly to Israel, you see? So these are little things. As I understand it, altogether, they took out, with all these different activities, about 12,000 Ethiopian Jews, which is a large number compared to what they had before, which was nothing, or 100 or 200. But I do want to say that 6,000 Jews died trying to walk through and they couldn't make it, or in the unhealthy refugee camps surrounded by a bunch of other people with diseases running around. So they saved 12,000, but they lost 6,000. That's not so simple. Okay? It was a success to a limited degree. They got out most of the Jews in Sudan refugee camps to Israel, But the great majority of Ethiopian Jews were still stuck in Ethiopia, right? In Tigray and Gondar. Now, how was Israel able to pull this off and Sudan did not interfere? Clearly the fix is in. I think that the dictator of Sudan, who was a shady character, General Numeri, had some kind of bribe or secret deal to look the other way. He couldn't keep a thing like that secret. That's what my reading over the years has convinced me. I've seen articles by these Arab guys who were very bitter over this, and they said, the fix was in. Local Sudanese police and officials resented this aflaya l'tovat hayudim. If you're a Sudanese official, you say, how come these guys get out in a truck and nobody else is taken out? They always say, well, we're just doing humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid? How come it's these 5 Jews over here and nobody for the humanitarian? You're leaving everybody else behind. And let me tell you something, this built up resentment, which eventually overthrew Numeri years later. It's important to realize that we're talking about the removal to Israel of small numbers of people. So it wasn't like the Arab world had something to, rise up in fury because Israel's bringing 100,000 or something like that out. In very small numbers. And so in order to really get worked up about it, when Israel's not going to get an infusion of mass numbers, you have to be pretty Arab, Islamic, be a real schmo, let's put it that way. They make a matter of principle, they can't get one Jew out. Baruch Hashem, they wasn't able to get that kind of rage running throughout the Arab world. The small scale of these smuggling operations, in my opinion, is what led somebody like General Numeri and the others to look the other way in return for money and favors. But it's always touch and go. Now things continued this way over time into the early 80s, but then things were vastly complicated by what they call the Great Famine that hit Ethiopia in the early 80s. Let's take a look at the next slide. Look at this. A widespread famine hit Ethiopia. On top of everything else, from 83 to 85, the worst famine in a century, 1.2 million dead. Okay? 400,000 refugees fled the country. Another 2.5 million people were internally displaced. 200,000 children were orphaned. These are human catastrophes that we in America don't really pay much attention to. The Mengistu-led military dictatorship used the famine in Ethiopia as a government policy by restricting food supplies for a counterinsurgency strategy against the Tigray People's Liberation Front guerrilla soldiers. So in other words, if you're Jewish and you live in Tigray province, the government is withholding food to starve your whole place out so that the rebels will have to give in. And for social transformation in non-insurgent areas against people of Tigray provinces, so you get what I'm saying? These are like Stalin in Ukraine. You deliberately withhold food from people so that they will die. Due to organized government policies that deliberately multiplied the effect of the famine, over 1.2 million people died in Ethiopia from the famine. A majority were from Tigray and the Amhara region and other places. So the Jews, again, it's not a specifically anti-Jewish thing, but they're right in the middle of it, aren't they? The wrong place at the wrong time. Now, the refugees and the refugee camps in Sudan, these are the guys that got out. So many now die of starvation and malnutrition. Because you're already starving when you leave and walk. If you're full belly and healthy, you can walk 200 miles. It's not push-it, but you can walk 200 miles. If you're malnourished and sick and this and other, you're going to die on the way you walk 200 miles, let alone past the 200 miles. For the Jews, this was in addition to those who had already died on the trek that I mentioned before, the 6,000. For the 12,000 Jews who made it to Israel, it's now terrible anguish. What is my bubby? What's my cousin? What's my brother back in Ethiopia and in Sudan? They're dying from the starvation. Okay? It was terrible to see that their relatives are now dying in this way, and they begged Israel to do something. Now there's 12,000 in Israel, like a lobby to beg Israel to do something. Another 5,000 will die from malnutrition during the Great Famine. Jews I'm talking about, and sickness, being waiting to be taken to Israel. So I repeat what I said before. Imagine if Israel taken them out all before 73. It's a tragedy. So by 84, 85, the situation was this. The Jews were divided into two groups. There were those still inside Ethiopia, and those who made it to Sudan, with more coming all the time fleeing the famine. The ones in Ethiopia were just in bad shape. Israel had zero leverage with that nut Mengistu. Neither did the USA or any other Western country. It was not that Mengistu was targeting the Jews, but he was targeting Tigray province, which mainly included the Jews. Then there's the other group, the Jews in Sudan, and the refugee camps. That's a different matter. the Sudanese dictator Nimeri, Jafar Nimeri, always nimble, always an opportunist, was subject to pressure at that point. Not from Israel, but pressure from the United States of America. Okay? Because Nimeri needed money and weapons and international recognition and things of that sort. Because you see, within Sudan, the army was not loyal to him. The politicians were not loyal to him. Only his personal KGB was loyal to him. And he needed to supply those guys for his personal security with weapons and money and things like that. The international situation in the mid-'80s is too complicated for me to explain tonight. But you get the idea. At this point, when Israel had no leverage, American Jews stepped in a funny way. By this time, mid-'80s, the American Jewish establishment had finally assimilated the importance of Ethiopian Jewry issue. The federations were on board. Matter of fact, it was PC in a big way, because that way the Jews are helping a black group. So it took to the 80s for this idea to get in there, but once it becomes part of the federation culture, then things can happen. In addition, Shimon Peres by now was Prime Minister of Israel, and he enjoyed the best of relations with Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, and even he had Bill Casey, the CIA, on board. So it's a positive, perfect storm. Israel was therefore able to ask the Reagan administration to help get the Jews out of Sudan through mass airlifts. Can you, America, talk to these guys in Sudan? One member of the Reagan administration, Richard Krieger, a Jewish guy, later was the head of the Holocaust Museum, I think. He had a great idea. He played the Protocols of Zion card. In June of '84, a high-ranking Sudanese official came to Washington to ask for money and weapons. Krieger said like this: look, you know the Jews run America. Jewish lobby runs the country. They control Congress. They control Reagan. And the Sudanese guy said, I guess, yes, I know that. You see, you can't talk to them in the language of humanitarianism. You can't just feel people are starving. Doesn't mean garnish. But you say the Jews, they control everything. Okay? If you want this aid to go through, I'll just give you good advice. You have to get the American Jews to you have to let America take the Jews out. And then the Jews will give the green light, and Sudan will get what it wants. And George Shultz played along. They told him about it. And let's go to the next one. When he goes to see Secretary of the United States, Secretary of State, George Shultz, I guess, what can I tell you? The Jews run everything. You know what I'm saying? And I'll tell you again, that works instantly for a guy from Sudan. You can't use any other argument, but that they understand perfectly. Okay? So, accordingly, Nimeri, who said, oh, the Jews run the country. Okay, fine, we got that's the price of doing business. He says, the Jews may be blown. I'll tell you what, you give me the money and everything, I'll let the Jews be flown out of Khartoum Airport. No, it's a real airlift. But because it'll be Farhesi, because it'll be public, I have several conditions. Let's go to the next one. It can't be Israeli planes. I can't have Magen Davids flying around. It can't be with Israeli guys speaking Hebrew. My own people will kill me. And they can't fly to Israel. They fly to Europe. So it's like a humanitarian thing. This is when Muslims and Africans are pouring into Europe, fleeing the famines. That's one of the reasons why these people from third world countries are in Europe now today. This will be part of that, okay? Like other African refugees. Israel said, fine, okay, we'll do whatever it takes. But that means we can't use Israeli planes. We've got to find a civilian airliner. Where are you going to find a civilian airliner who wants to fly into Khartoum? Well, they pull out their Jewish Rolodex, as I said before, and they find the right match in Belgium. Let's go to the next one. Okay? These are the guy in the lower right hand. Here is Ephraim Levy, who became the head of the Mossad. British guy. He's retired now, of course. Ephraim Levy calls these two guys, well, the guy above, George Gudelman. George Gudelman. He's a Polish Yid. He's grown up in Belgium. And like some of these entrepreneurs, he happened to build up a big airline business, civilian airline business. You're going to laugh at what I'm telling you. He's making a lot of money because he's got the contract to fly all the Muslims to Mecca. He says he has like 50 airliners or something like that. Boeing 707s. And there's a business, you know? And he's a successful European entrepreneur and businessman. The guy on the left-hand side is Jean Gaulle, who's also a Polish Yid, who by this time was a big politician in Belgium, was the Minister of the Interior, which means the FBI and the CIA worked for him at that time. And so the Mossad calls these guys out, I guess, we need to get these guys out of thing. We're looking for a non-Israeli, non-Jewish airliner. Will you help? Now, Gudelman stands to lose a lot because he said, my Muslim guys find out about this, I'm going to lose my contract. It's my parnasa. Okay? But he's a Yiddish Yid. He said, my parents went to the Holocaust. You don't have to say another word. And he agrees. But please, please, no PR. Okay? And this can't happen unless the Belgian government gives the green light. Jean Gaulle is the guy in charge. And he said, I give the green light. And he tells the Belgian police and the Belgian CIA and FBI, let this happen. Okay? And that's what happens. So now in late 84, these Belgian planes of Gudelman do the airlift. They have no Jewish markers on them whatsoever. Starting in November 84. And so what it means is like this. The Americans get the trucks and they bring these Jews from refugee camps straight to the airport in Khartoum, a regular airport, and they put them on these Belgian things on the side of the airport and they fly off to Brussels. Okay? Once they're in Brussels, then they fly to Israel. And that, my friends, is what they call Operation Moses. Things go smooth for a while because, after all, there are no Jews involved. It's a humanitarian effort of a European chunk. And 7,000 Ethiopian Jews leave quietly from the refugee camps in Sudan, as a majority of the Jews there. However, I'm sorry to say, my friends, we all know this, how long can Jews keep a secret? Okay? And eventually, some idiots blabbed their mouths. It's unbelievable how bad they were. Let's go to the next one. The first is a sod for broad, which in Yiddish means is a secret known by the whole town. The first to reveal the secret was Aryeh Dolchin, one of the leaders of Israel's Liberal Party and chairman of the Jewish Agency. You're the chairman of Sachnut. Shut up. He divulged the secret to donors from Canada. They published it in their bulletins, and one of these idiots gave it to the New York Times. I'll tell you again, the irresponsibility here boggles the mind. Right? Maybe Dolchin figured, he wasn't that smart guy, Dolchin figured, I'll just tell a couple of Canadian millionaires. And let's say they put in their bulletin, which was stupid. At that time, there's no internet. Who's the dumbbell that sent a copy of this bulletin to the New York Times? It's just unbelievable. The Israeli press restrained itself because they understood what's going on. But an interview from the journal Nekuda with Yehuda dominance from the Sachnut led to the cessation operation. It's impossible to know for sure how many Ethiopian Jews were blabbed to their fate. Isn't that terrible? It's just unbelievable. We're near the end here. In January of 85, Shimon Peres, smart cookie, had a press conference, and he said like this, we're smuggling the Jews out through the Belgian airliners. Please don't tell anybody. This was at a press conference. Let's go to the next one. Peres, how can you do it? How can you do it? Okay? Nimeri, back in Sudan, when it hits the international news, it blows a gut. Understandably, the Sudanese public soon overthrew him because of this. Nimeri shuts down the airlift. Another few days, and every Jew would have been flown out. Isn't it a tragedy? It's like they say another week or so, something like that, and the last Jew would have been taken out of the Sudanese refugee camps. And now they're stuck over here. This poor guy from Belgium, George Gudelman, exposed, loses all of his Mecca clients because all the Muslims are going crazy, and he goes bankrupt. And Israel does not help him, which confirms what Truman said very famously, you want gratitude, get a dog. He lost it. I would tell you something, not only gave the planes, I don't remember the exact details, but he said, I will pay the expenses, like I'll pay my pilots and so forth. So he was really a Yiddish Yid. And what happened afterwards, I don't remember, I think he started another company and had trouble. But I wish I could say the good guys ended up well. Although, he always said the rest of his life, he says, I don't regret doing it. So Operation Moses is partially successful. What about the poor souls left behind? In Sudan, in Ethiopia, and Tigray? Are they going to die because of PR? Or going to die because of neglect? Rabbi, it's late. It's too late. I've gone long enough. So I'm going to fold this into my next lecture. With that, I wish you a good night.